Threads of History, a podcast that aims to go back in time to connect an event or instance to its origin through several threads of continuity across time, space, culture, and historic moments. Welcome to the podcast. I am Mike Shellhammer. Today's episode is on the presidency of Abraham Lincoln, his candidacy brought on by the brand new Republican Party, and its origin in the formation, actions, and ultimate breakup of the Whig Party years before. Today we make one of what I anticipate to be many looks at the mid-19th century United States, and finally take up the topic that gives this podcast its cover art. That topic is Abraham Lincoln. His presidency is one of contradictions, tragedy, slavery, war, and bitterness. But it also includes so many seeds from which the modern United States government would sprout, ideas of freedom and equality, and some of the most positively influential actions made by any president in U.S. history. Lincoln's political life has its origin in his first political party and one of the major political parties in U.S. history, that is, the Whig Party. Here is some background to set the scene. During the 1790s, the first major U.S. parties arose in the form of the Federalist Party, led by Alexander Hamilton, and the Democratic-Republican Party, led by Thomas Jefferson. After 1815, the Democratic Republicans emerged as the sole major political party at the national level, but became increasingly polarized. A nationalist wing, led by Henry Clay, favored policies such as the Second Bank of the United States and the implementation of a protective tariff. A second group, the Old Republicans, opposed these policies, instead favoring a strict interpretation of the Constitution and a weak federal government. In the 1824 presidential election, Speaker of the House Henry Clay, Secretary of the Treasury William H. Crawford, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, and General Andrew Jackson all sought the presidency as members of the Democratic-Republican Party. Crawford favored state sovereignty and a strict constructionist view of the Constitution, while Clay and Adams favored high tariffs and the national bank. Regionalism played a central role, with Jackson strongest in the West. And now this is when the West in the United States was still east of the Mississippi River. Jackson won a plurality of the popular and electoral vote in the 1824 election, but not a majority. The House of Representatives had to decide the outcome of the election. Speaker Clay supported Adams, who was elected as president by the House, and Clay was appointed as Secretary of State. Jackson called it the corrupt bargain, and I do not blame him. In the years following the 1824 election, former members of the Democratic-Republican Party split into hostile factions. Supporters of the President Adams and Clay joined the many former Federalists, such as Daniel Webster, to form a group informally known as the Adams Party. Meanwhile, supporters of Jackson, Crawford, and Vice President John C. Calhoun joined to oppose the Adams administration's nationalist agenda, becoming informally known as the Jacksonians. Due in part to the superior organization of the Jacksonians, Jackson defeated Adams in the 1828 presidential election, taking 56% of the popular vote. Clay became the leader of the National Republican Party, which opposed President Jackson, and by the early 1830s, Jacksonians organized into what they would be calling the Democratic Party. Despite Jackson's decisive victory in the 1828 election, National Republicans initially believed that Jackson's party would collapse once Jackson took office. Vice President John C. Calhoun split from the administration in 1831, but differences over their support of the tariff of 1832 prevented Calhoun's followers from joining the National Republicans. Meanwhile, the anti-Masonic Party formed following the disappearance and possible murder of William Morgan in 1826. The anti-Masonic movement, strongest in the Northeast, gave rise to or expanded the use of many innovations, which became accepted practice among the other political parties, including nominating conventions and party newspapers. Clay rejected overtures from the anti-Masonic Party, and his attempt to convince Calhoun to serve as his running mate failed, leaving the opposition to Jackson split among different leaders when the National Republicans would nominate Clay for president. Jackson won another decisive victory in the 1832 presidential election, taking 55% of the national popular vote and 88% of the popular vote in the slave states south of Kentucky and Maryland. Clay's defeat discredited the National Republican Party, encouraging those opposed to Jackson to seek to create a more effective opposition party. Jackson, by 1832, was determined to destroy the Second Bank of the United States, which was supported by his enemies. Shortly after Jackson's re-election, South Carolina passed a measure to nullify the Tariff of 1832, beginning the nullification crisis. Jackson strongly denied the right of South Carolina to nullify a federal law, but the crisis was resolved after Congress passed the Tariff of 1833. The nullification crisis briefly scrambled the partisan divisions that had emerged after 1824, as many within the Jacksonian coalition opposed President Jackson's threat of force against South Carolina, while some opposition leaders like Daniel Webster supported the federal government in the dispute. In South Carolina and other states, those opposed to Jackson began to form some small so-called Whig parties. The Whig label implicitly compared King Andrew, as in King Andrew Jackson, to King George III, the King of Great Britain at the time of the American Revolution. Jackson's decision to remove government deposits from the National Bank ended any possibility of a Webster-Jackson alliance and helped to solidify partisan lines. The removal of the deposits drew opposition from both pro-bank National Republicans and states' rights Southerners like Willie Person Magnum of North Carolina, the latter of whom accused Jackson of flouting the Constitution. In late 1833, Clay began to hold a series of dinners with opposition leaders in order to settle on a candidate to oppose Martin Van Buren, the likely Democratic nominee in the 1836 presidential election. While Jackson's opponents could not agree on a single presidential candidate, they coordinated in the Senate to oppose Jackson's initiatives. Historian Michael Holt writes that the birth of the Whig Party can be dated to Clay and his allies taking control of the Senate in December 1833. The National Republicans, who you remember would have been opposed to Jackson's Democrats, including Clay and Webster, formed the core of the Whig Party. But many anti-Masons like William H. Seward of New York and Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania also joined. Several prominent Democrats defected to the Whigs, including Magnum, former Attorney General John Berrien, and John Tyler of Virginia. The Whig Party's first major action was to censure Jackson for the removal of the national bank deposits, thereby establishing opposition to Jackson's executive power as the organizing principle of this new party. In doing so, the Whigs were able to shed the elitist image that had persistently hindered the National Republicans. Throughout 1834 and 1835, the Whigs successfully incorporated National Republican and anti-Masonic state-level organizations and established new state party organizations in southern states. The anti-Masonic heritage to the Whigs included a distrust of the behind-the-scenes political maneuvering by the party bosses, instead encouraging direct appeals to the people through gigantic rallies, parades, and rhetorical rabble-rousing. The Whig Party ran candidates across the country and would bring a spirited opposition to Martin Van Buren's re-election chances. Early successes in various states made many Whigs optimistic about 1836's election, but an improving economy bolstered Van Buren's standing. Northern Whigs cast aside both Clay and Webster in favor of General William Henry Harrison, a former senator who had led U.S. forces in the 1811 Battle of Tippecanoe. Though he had not previously been affiliated with the National Republicans, Harrison indicated that he shared the party's concerns over Jackson's executive power and favored federal investments in infrastructure. Southern Whigs coalesced around Senator Hugh Lawson White, a longtime Jackson ally, but he had opposed Martin Van Buren's candidacy. Ultimately, Van Buren won a majority of the electoral and popular vote in the 1836 election. In the lead up to the 1840 election, a recovering economy convinced the Whigs to support Harrison, who was generally seen as the Whig candidate best able to win over Democrats and new voters. Harrison would win the presidential nomination on the fifth ballot of the 1839 Whig National Convention. For vice president, the Whigs nominated John Tyler, a former states' rights Democrat, selected for the ticket primarily because of other Southern supporters of Clay refusing to serve as Harrison's running mate. Log cabins and hard cider became the dominant symbols of the Whig campaign as the party sought to portray Harrison as a man of the people. The Whigs also assailed Van Buren's handling of the economy and argued that traditional Whig policies, such as the restoration of the national bank and the implementation of protective tariffs, would help to restore the economy. With the economy still in the downturn, Harrison decisively defeated Van Buren, taking a wide majority electoral vote and just under 53% of the popular vote in the election of 1840. Vice President John Tyler would take over for Harrison after just 31 days. Harrison's death derailed some Whig objectives, and Tyler seemed to put Whig priorities away in favor of others. Tyler had never accepted much of the Whig economic program, and he soon clashed with Henry Clay and other congressional Whigs. In August 1841, Tyler vetoed Clay's national bank bill, holding that bill as unconstitutional. He was also courting Democratic support through his support of the annexation of Texas. He saw the issue as a means to his re-election under the Democrats or some other party. He had been expelled from the Whigs over his twice veto of the national bank bill, which resulted in Henry Clay being the nominee for the Whigs in the next election in 1844. To the surprise of Clay and other Whigs, the 1844 Democratic National Convention rejected Van Buren in favor of James K. Polk and established a platform calling for the acquisition of both Texas and the Oregon Country. Having won the presidential nomination at the 1844 Whig National Convention unopposed, Clay and the other Whigs were initially confident they would defeat the divided Democrats and their relatively obscure candidate. But ultimately, Polk won the election, taking 49.5% of the popular vote and the majority of the electoral vote. In the final weeks of Tyler's presidency, a small group of Southern Whigs joined with congressional Democrats to pass a joint resolution providing for the annexation of Texas, and Texas subsequently became a state in 1845. Following this annexation, Polk began preparations for a potential war with Mexico, which still regarded Texas as a part of its republic and contended that Texas's true southern border was the Nueces River rather than the Rio Grande. After a skirmish known as the Thornton Affair broke out on the northern side of the Rio Grande, Polk called on Congress to declare war against Mexico, arguing that Mexico had invaded American territory by crossing the Rio Grande. Many Whigs argued that Polk had provoked war with Mexico by sending a force under General Zachary Taylor to the Rio Grande, but only a minority of Whigs voted against the declaration of war, as they feared that opposing the war would be politically unpopular. Speaking of the Mexican-American War, the final several presidential candidates put forth by the Whig Party were generals in the American Army who had served during the war. Zachary Taylor with his Vice President Millard Fillmore were elected in 1848 to President and Vice President. Taylor won the election with a majority of the electoral vote and a plurality of the popular vote. Taylor improved on Clay's 1844 performance in the South and benefited from the defection of many Democrats to Van Buren in the North, which effectively split the Democratic voters. However, Taylor died in July 1850, and his vice president, Millard Fillmore, would become president. His presidency was marked by the Compromise of 1850, which instituted the popular sovereignty of citizens in the territories to choose to allow slavery, among other things, and his enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. The Whig Party became badly split between pro-compromise Whigs, like Fillmore and Webster, and anti-compromise Whigs, like William Seward, who demanded the repeal of the Fugitive Slave Act. In all, Harrison, Tyler, Taylor, and Fillmore were either elected to the presidency as Whigs, or as is the case with the deaths of Harrison and Taylor, served as president after being elected vice president. But this would be the beginning of the end of the Whig Party. Despite their decisive loss in the 1852 elections and the loss of the presidency to Franklin Pierce, most Whig leaders believed the party could recover during the Pierce presidency in much the same way as it had recovered under President Polk. However, the strong economy still prevented the Whig economic program from gaining any support, and the party failed to develop an effective platform on which to campaign. The debate over the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act, which effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise by allowing slavery in territories north of the 3630 parallel, which shook up traditional partisan alignments. Across the northern states, opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act gave rise to anti-Nebraska coalitions consisting of Democrats, along with Free Soilers and Whigs against the spread of slavery. In Michigan and Wisconsin, these two coalitions labeled themselves as the Republican Party. Like their Free Soil predecessors, Republican leaders generally did not call for the abolition of slavery, but instead sought to prevent the extension of slavery in the territories. Another political coalition appeared in the form of the nativist and anti-Catholic Know Nothing movement, which eventually organized itself into what was called the American Party. Both the Republican Party and the Know Nothings portrayed themselves as the natural Whig heirs in the battle against Democratic executive tyranny, but the Republicans focused on the slave power, and the Know Nothings focused on the supposed danger of mass immigration and a Catholic conspiracy. While the Republican Party almost exclusively appealed to Northerners, the Know Nothings gathered many adherents in both the North and South. Some individuals joined both groups, even while they remained part of the Whig Party or part of the Democratic Party. As cooperation between Northern and Southern Whigs increasingly appeared to be impossible, leaders from both sections continued to abandon the party. Though he did not share the nativist views of the Know Nothings, in 1855, Millard Fillmore became a member of the Know Nothing movement and encouraged his Whig followers to join as well. In September 1855, Seward led his faction of Whigs into the Republican Party, effectively marking the end of the Whig Party as an independent and significant political force. Thus, the 1856 presidential election became a three-sided contest between Democrats, the Know Nothing Party, and the Republican Party. As I have just explained, the Republican Party grew out of the opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which repealed the Missouri Compromise and opened Kansas Territory and Nebraska Territory to chattel slavery and future admission as slave states. Republicans called for economic and social modernization. They denounced the expansion of chattel slavery as a great evil, but did not call for ending it in the southern states. The first public meeting of the general anti-Nebraska movement, at which the name Republican was proposed, was held on March 20, 1854, at the Little White Schoolhouse in Ripon, Wisconsin. The name was partly chosen to pay homage to Thomas Jefferson's Democratic-Republican Party. The first official party convention was held on July 6, 1854, in Jackson, Michigan. The elections of 1854 saw the Republicans take Michigan and make advances in many states, but this election was dominated by the emergence of the short-lived Know Nothing Party. By 1855, the Republican Party controlled the majority in the House of Representatives. The new party decided to hold an organizing convention in Pittsburgh in early 1856, leading up to the Philadelphia Convention. So, at the 1856 Republican National Convention in Philadelphia, the party adopted a national platform emphasizing opposition to the expansion of chattel slavery into the U.S. territories. While Republican nominee John C. Fremont lost the 1856 presidential election to Democrat James Buchanan, Buchanan only managed to win 4 of the 14 northern states, winning his home state of Pennsylvania narrowly. Republicans fared better in congressional and local elections, but Know Nothing candidates took a significant number of seats, creating an awkward three-party arrangement. Despite the loss of the presidency and the lack of a majority in Congress, Republicans were able to orchestrate a Republican Speaker of the House, which went to Nathaniel P. Banks. Historian James M. McPherson writes regarding Banks's speakership as, quote, "If any one moment marked the birth of the Republican Party, this was it," unquote. The Republicans were eager for the elections of 1860. Former Whig Party member and Illinois Representative Abraham Lincoln spent several years building support within the party, campaigning heavily for Fremont in 1856 and making a bid for the Senate in 1858, only losing to Democrat Stephen A. Douglas, but gaining national attention for the Lincoln-Douglas debates it produced. At the 1860 Republican National Convention, Lincoln consolidated support among opponents of New York Senator William H. Seward, a fierce abolitionist who some Republicans feared would be a bit too radical for the crucial states like Pennsylvania and Indiana, as well as those who disapproved of his support for Irish immigrants. The 1860 Democratic National Convention had adjourned in Charleston, South Carolina without agreeing on a nominee, so a second convention was held in Baltimore, which nominated Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas, who was the recent opponent of Lincoln. Douglas's support for the concept of popular sovereignty, which called for each territory's settlers to decide locally on the status of slavery, alienated many radical pro-slavery Southern Democrats who wanted the territories and perhaps other lands open to slavery. With President Buchanan's support, Southern Democrats held their own convention, nominating Vice President John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. The 1860 Constitutional Union Convention nominated a ticket led by former Tennessee Senator John Bell. The Constitutional Union Party was another political party, a very minor party, that existed in 1860. Lincoln was ultimately elected president in the general election in the rematch against Douglas, with electoral votes won by 4 candidates who combined to win 15 of the 33 states. Lincoln had not been on the ballot in a single Southern state, and even if the vote for Democrats had not been split between Douglas, Breckinridge, and Bell, the Republicans would have still won, but just without the popular vote. So there it is. We have the lead up to Lincoln's presidency and his victory in 1860. Following his victory, all the slave states began to consider secession. Lincoln was not scheduled to take office until March 1861, which left incumbent Democratic President James Buchanan, a president who had been very friendly to Southern concerns, to preside over the country until Lincoln would be inaugurated. President Buchanan declared that secession was illegal, but he denied that the federal government had any power to resist it. Lincoln had no official power to act while the secession crisis escalated. Even though he had no official power to act, nonetheless, Lincoln was urged to respond to the crisis. Realizing that soothing words on the rights of slaveholders would alienate his Republican base, while taking a strong stand on the indestructibility of the Union would further inflame the Southerners and secessionists, Lincoln chose a policy of silence. He believed that, given enough time without any overt acts or threats to the South, Southern Unionists would carry the day and bring their states back into the Union. In December 1860, both the House and Senate formed special committees to address the unfolding crisis. Lincoln communicated with various congressmen that there was room for negotiation on issues such as fugitive slaves, slavery in the District of Columbia, and the domestic slave trade. However, he made it clear that he was unalterably opposed to anything which would allow the expansion of slavery into any new states or the territories. Lincoln had believed erroneously that Southern threats of secession were mostly just bluster, and that the sectional crisis would be diffused, as it had in 1820 and 1850. However, many Southerners were convinced that with Lincoln in the president's chair, that the restriction of slavery in the territories would ultimately lead to the extinction of slavery in the entire United States. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina voted to secede, and 6 other Southern states seceded in the next 40 days. In February, these Southern states formed the Confederate States of America and elected Jefferson Davis as their provisional president. Despite the formation of the CSA, the slaveholding states of Arkansas, North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri still remained part of the Union. In February 1861, 2 final political efforts were made to preserve the Union. The first was made by a group of 131 delegates sent by 21 states to a peace conference held at the Willards Hotel in the nation's capital. The convention submitted to Congress a 7-point constitutional amendment proposal similar in content to the earlier Crittenden Compromise. The Crittenden Compromise was an unsuccessful proposal to permanently enshrine slavery in the United States Constitution and thereby make it unconstitutional for any future Congresses to end slavery. That proposal was rejected by the Senate, and it was never even considered in the House. The second effort to be made to try to preserve the Union was the Never Never constitutional amendment on slavery that would shield the institutions of the states from congressional interference and from future constitutional amendments. Commonly known as the Corwin Amendment, the measure was approved by Congress, which actually really surprises me, but it was not ratified by any state legislatures. Also in February 1861, Lincoln would board a special train that would take him to the nation's capital over the course of several weeks. Lincoln spoke several times each day during the train trip. While his speeches were mostly extemporaneous, his message was consistent. He had no hostile intentions towards the South, disunion was not acceptable, and he intended to enforce the laws and protect federal property. Rumors abounded during the course of the trip for various plots to kill Lincoln. Samuel Felton, president of the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad, hired Detective Allen Pinkerton, yes, that Pinkerton, to investigate reports that secessionists might try to sabotage the railroad along the route. In conducting his investigation, Pinkerton obtained information that indicated to him that an attempt on Lincoln's life would be made in Baltimore. As a result of the threat, the travel schedule was altered, tracks were closed to other traffic, and the telegraph wires were cut to heighten security. Lincoln and his entourage passed through Baltimore's waterfront at around 3 o'clock in the early morning of February 23rd, and arrived safely in the nation's capital a few hours later. Lincoln knew that his inaugural address would be delivered in an atmosphere filled with fear and anxiety, and amid that unstable political landscape. His first presidential inauguration occurred on March 4, 1861. Prior to taking the oath, Lincoln delivered his inaugural address. He opened by attempting to reassure the South that he had no intention or constitutional authority to interfere with slavery in states where it already existed. He promised to enforce the fugitive slave law and spoke favorably about a pending constitutional amendment that would preserve slavery in the states where it currently existed. He also assured the states that had already seceded that the federal government had no real ill will against them and would not violently attack them. After these assurances, however, Lincoln declared that secession was anarchy and that it was his duty to, quote, hold, occupy, and possess the property belonging to the government, unquote. Focusing on those within the South who were still on the fence regarding secession, Lincoln contrasted them with those that were still supporting of the Union. In his closing remarks, Lincoln spoke directly to the secessionists and asserted that no state could secede from the Union on its own power, and he emphasized the moral commitment that he was undertaking to preserve, protect, and defend the laws of the land. He then concluded the address with a firm but placating message. Quote, we are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone, all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as angels surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. Unquote. Lincoln began the process of constructing his cabinet on election night. In an effort to create a cabinet that would unite the Republican Party, Lincoln attempted to reach out to every faction of the party with a special emphasis on balancing former Whigs with former Democrats. The first cabinet position filled was that of Secretary of State. It was tradition for the president-elect to offer this, the most senior cabinet post, to the leading, meaning best known and most popular, person of his political party. William Seward was that man, and in mid-December 1860, it was offered to him. Lincoln's choice for Secretary of the Treasury was Ohio Senator Salmon P. Chase, Seward's chief political rival. Chase was the leader of the more radical faction of Republicans that sought to abolish slavery as quickly as possible. Seward, among others, opposed the selection of Chase because of both his strongly anti-slavery record and his opposition to any type of settlement with the South that could be considered appeasement for slaveholders. The most problematic cabinet selection made by Lincoln was that of Simon Cameron as the Secretary of War. Cameron was one of the most influential political leaders in the crucial political state of Pennsylvania, but he was also alleged to be one of the most corrupt. Historian William Guy Knapp believed that the final selection of Cameron for his soon-to-be critical position was a clear indicator that Lincoln did not anticipate a civil war. Feeling that Cameron was not capable of handling the War Department, Lincoln tactfully removed Cameron in January 1862 by appointing him as an ambassador. He was replaced by Edwin Stanton, a staunchly Unionist pro-business conservative Democrat who moved toward the radical Republican faction. Stanton worked more often and more closely with Lincoln than any other senior official. Thus, Lincoln filled up his staff of advisors and department heads with various prominent men from many different states and backgrounds, some of which would butt heads with Lincoln, and he nonetheless kept them on as a source for different perspectives. As we've previously mentioned, by the time Lincoln assumed office, 7 states declared their secession and had seized federal property within their bounds, but the United States retained control of major military installations at Fort Sumter near Charleston and Fort Pickens near Pensacola, Florida. Less secure than Fort Pickens, and situated in the secessionist hotbed of South Carolina, Fort Sumter emerged as an important symbolic issue in both the North and South during 1861. Any hope Lincoln might have had about using time to his advantage in addressing the crisis was shattered on his first full day in office when he read a letter from Major Robert Anderson, the commander at Fort Sumter, stating that his troops would run out of provisions within 4 to 6 weeks. Gustavus Fox, a U.S. Navy veteran, became a key figure in the Naval Department after his role in the Fort Sumter crisis. At a meeting on March 7, General Winfield Scott, a top-ranking general in the Army, and John G. Totten, the Army's chief engineer, said that simply reinforcing the fort was not possible, although the Secretary of the Navy, Wells, disagreed. Fox presented a plan for a naval resupply and reinforcement of the fort. The plan had been approved by Scott during the last month of the previous administration, but Buchanan had rejected it. On March 15th, Lincoln asked each cabinet member to provide a written answer to the question, assuming it to be possible to now provision Fort Sumter under all circumstances, is it wise to attempt it? Only Montgomery Blair, the Postmaster General, gave his unconditional approval to the plan. No decision was reached, but Lincoln personally dispatched Fox, Stephen A. Holbrook, and Ward Lamon to South Carolina to assess the situation. The recommendations that came back were that reinforcement was both necessary, since secessionist feelings ran high and threatened the fort, and feasible, despite Fort Commander Anderson's misgivings. On March 28th, Scott recommended that both Pickens and Sumter be abandoned, basing his decision more on political than military grounds. Lincoln's policy of resupplying Fort Sumter and Fort Pickens was designed to deny the right of secession without resorting to violence, which he hoped would allow the administration to maintain support among both Northerners and Southern Unionists. The Confederate President Jefferson Davis and his cabinet were already meeting to discuss the Sumter crisis during this time, and on April 10th, Davis decided to demand the surrender of the fort and bombard it if the demand was refused. An attack on the fort was initiated on April 12th, and the fort surrendered the next day. The relief expedition sent by the Union arrived too late to intervene. On April 15th, following the attack on Fort Sumter, Lincoln declared that a state of rebellion existed and called up a force of 75,000 state militiamen to serve 3-month terms. While northern states rallied to the request, border states such as Missouri refused to provide soldiers. Lincoln also called Congress into a special session to begin in July. Though an in-session Congress could potentially affect his freedom of action, Lincoln needed Congress to authorize funds to fight the war against the Confederacy. On the advice of Winfield Scott, Lincoln asked a political ally to offer General Robert E. Lee command of the Union forces, but Lee ultimately chose to serve the Confederacy. Union soldiers in southern states burned federal facilities to prevent Southern forces from taking control of them, while Confederate sympathizers led a riot in places like Baltimore. To ensure the security of the capital, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus in Maryland and ignored a court order ordering him to release a detained prisoner. While Lincoln struggled to maintain order in Maryland and other border states, Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, and Tennessee all seceded from the Union. North Carolina was actually the last state to secede. They did so on May 20th, 1861. Because Congress was now without many of its congressmen from southern states, Lincoln's Republicans enjoyed large majorities in both houses of Congress. War Democrats such as Andrew Johnson of Tennessee also provided support for many of Lincoln's policies, though Copperhead Democrats advocated peace with the Confederacy. From the start, it was clear that bipartisan support would be essential to success in the war effort, and any action such as the appointment of generals could alienate factions on both sides of the aisle. It was during this time, in April 1861, that Lincoln announced the Union blockade of all southern ports. Commercial ships could not get insurance and regular traffic ended. The blockade shut down the 10 Confederate seaports with railheads that moved almost all of the cotton, specifically some of the biggest southern seaports like New Orleans, Mobile, and Charleston. By June 1861, warships were stationed off of all of the principal southern seaports, and a year later nearly 300 ships were in service. Practically, the entire Confederate cotton crop was useless. Critical imports were scarce, and the coastal trade was largely ended. The measure of the blockade's success was not the few ships that slipped through, but the thousands that never even tried it. Merchant ships owned in Europe could not get insurance and were too slow to evade the blockade, and they simply just stopped coming to Confederate ports. Having been recalled by Lincoln, in July 1861, Congress supported his war proposals, providing appropriations for the expansion of the Army to 500,000 men. Organizing the Army would prove to be a challenge for Lincoln and the War Department, as many professional officers resisted civilian control, while many state militias sought to act autonomously. Knowing that success in the war required the support of local officials in mobilizing these soldiers, Lincoln used patronage powers and personal diplomacy to ensure that Northern leaders remained devoted to the war effort. Having succeeded in rallying the North against secession, Lincoln next determined to attack the Confederate capital of Richmond, which was located just 100 miles from Washington. Lincoln was disappointed by the state of the War Department and the Navy Department, and Scott counseled that the Army needed more time to train, but Lincoln nonetheless ordered an offensive. As the aged Scott was unable to lead the Army himself, General Irvin McDowell led the force of 30,000 men south, where he met a force led by Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard. At the First Battle of Bull Run, the Confederate Army dealt the Union a major defeat, ending any hope of a quick end to the war. Following the secession of the four states after the Battle of Fort Sumter, one of Lincoln's major concerns was that the slave-holding border states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri would stay out of the Confederacy. Of these four states, Lincoln was least concerned about Delaware, which had a proportionally large pro-Union population. Due to its location, Maryland remained a critical part of the Union. Lincoln continued to suppress Southern sympathizers in that state and refused to take any harsher measures. Maryland's election of Unionist Governor Augustus Bradford in November of 1861 ensured that Maryland would remain part of the Union. Perhaps even more critical than Maryland was Kentucky, which provided access to key rivers and served as a gateway to Tennessee and the Midwest. Hoping to avoid unsettling the delicate balance in that state, Lincoln publicly ordered military leaders to respect Kentucky's declared neutrality, but quietly provided support to Kentucky's Unionists. The Confederates were the first to violate this neutrality, seizing control of the town of Columbus, while the Union would capture the important town of Paducah. Paducah. It's an odd name. Like Kentucky, Missouri controlled access to key rivers and had a large pro-Confederate population. Lincoln appointed General John C. Fremont to ensure Union control of the area, but Fremont alienated many in that state by declaring martial law and issuing a proclamation freeing slaves that had belonged to the rebels. Lincoln removed Fremont and reversed that order, but Missouri emerged as the most problematic of the border states for Lincoln. After the defeat of the Federal troops at the First Battle of Bull Run, Lincoln summoned Major General George B. McClellan to replace McDowell. McClellan had won minor battles in the Western Virginia campaign, and those victories had allowed Unionist West Virginia to hold the Wheeling Convention and eventually secede from Virginia. With Lincoln's support, McClellan rejected Scott's Anaconda Plan, instead proposing a strike against Virginia which would end the war with one climactic battle. After Winfield Scott retired in late 1861, Lincoln appointed McClellan general-in-chief of all the Union armies. McClellan was a young West Point graduate, a railroad executive, and a Pennsylvania Democrat, and it took him several months to plan and attempt this peninsular campaign. The campaign's objective was to capture Richmond by moving the Army of the Potomac by boat to the Virginia Peninsula and then overland to the Confederate capital. McClellan's repeated delays frustrated Lincoln and Congress, as did his position that no troops were needed to defend Washington. That sounds incredibly ridiculous in hindsight. In response to Bull Run, Congress established the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War to provide oversight of military operations. Aside from the committee's activities, Congress would generally defer to Lincoln's leadership throughout the war. A group of congressmen known as the Radical Republicans often became frustrated with Lincoln's conduct of the war and reluctance to immediately push for abolition, but Lincoln was able to maintain good relations with many of the Radical Republican leaders, including Senator Charles Sumner. In January 1862, Lincoln, who had been frustrated by months of inaction, ordered McClellan to begin the offensive by the end of February. When McClellan still failed to launch his attack, members of Congress urged Lincoln to replace McClellan, either with McDowell or with Fremont, but Lincoln decided to retain McClellan as commander of the Army of the Potomac over either potential replacement. He did, however, remove McClellan as general-in-chief of the Army in May, leaving that office vacant. McClellan moved against Confederate forces in March, and the Army of the Potomac fought the bloody and inconclusive Battle of Seven Pines at the end of May. Following that battle, Robert E. Lee took command of Confederate forces in Virginia, and he led his forces to victory in the 7 Days battles, which effectively brought the Peninsula Campaign to a close. In late June 1862, while the Army of the Potomac was fighting the 7 Days battles, Lincoln appointed John Pope to command the newly formed Army of Virginia. On July 11th, Lincoln summoned Henry Halleck from the Western theater of the war to take command as general-in-chief of the Army. Shortly thereafter, Lincoln asked Ambrose Burnside to replace McClellan as commander of the Army of the Potomac, but Burnside, who was close friends with McClellan, had declined the post. Pope's forces moved south towards Richmond, and in late August, the Army of Virginia met the Confederate Army, which would be called the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, in the Battle of Bull Run. Yes, the Second Battle of Bull Run, which was another major Union defeat. Following that battle, Lincoln turned to McClellan once again, placing him in command of the Army of Virginia as well as the Army of the Potomac. Very shortly after McClellan's return to command, General Lee's forces crossed the Potomac River into Maryland, leading to the Battle of Antietam in September 1862. The ensuing Union victory was among the bloodiest in American history, but it enabled Lincoln to announce that he would issue an Emancipation Proclamation in January. Following the battle, McClellan resisted the president's demand that he pursue Lee's retreating and exposed army. I just mentioned Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, and it is so important to this story and the story of American history that I'm going to take a divergence into discussing it. On January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. With it, he freed all slaves in Confederate or contested areas of the South. However, the proclamation did not include slaves in non-Confederate border states and in parts of the Confederacy which were under Union control. During the war, Republicans and Northern free blacks called on the president to act decisively to end slavery. Members of Lincoln's administration had hoped that an act of emancipation would make it difficult for Britain or for France to officially recognize the Confederacy in view of the anti-slavery sentiments among their home populations, and this was especially true in Britain. In July 1862, President Lincoln announced to his cabinet that he intended to issue an Emancipation Proclamation in his capacity as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces in a time of war. The proclamation would free all slaves in areas still in rebellion, and henceforth it would be a Union objective to destroy slavery within the Confederate South. Lincoln's cabinet had persuaded him to wait until a Union victory, lest it appear to the world like an act of desperation. The president warned that if the rebellion did not end by January 1st, 1863, he would issue his presidential order of emancipation and move to destroy slavery in the rebel states once and for all. In the proclamation, Lincoln left out occupied Tennessee and certain occupied parts of Louisiana and Virginia, as well as the loyal slave states. The document declared, with the exception of those areas, that all slaves in the rebellious states were hereafter forever free. It also asserted that the Union Army would now receive black men into their service as regular soldiers. It's interesting to note that the U.S. Navy had accepted black sailors from the onset of the war. In a single stroke of his pen, Abraham Lincoln issued the most revolutionary measure ever to come from an American president up to that time. Still, the president was worried that the courts might void his wartime proclamation after the war on the grounds that any confiscation of quote-unquote property required due process of law, and that such a policy could only be adopted by a law passed by Congress. This worry would push Lincoln to advocate for the 13th Amendment, the abolition of slavery in the United States, later on in his presidency. Even with the bloody win at Antietam, the Republican losses in the 1862 midterm elections had frustrated Lincoln, and so he replaced McClellan with Ambrose Burnside. Against the advice of the president, Burnside prematurely launched an offensive across the Rappahannock River and was stunningly defeated by Lee at the Battle of Fredericksburg in December of that year. Not only had Burnside been defeated on the battlefield, but his soldiers were disgruntled and undisciplined. Desertions had already been a problem in the army, and they increased after the defeat at Fredericksburg. This defeat also amplified the criticisms of radical Republicans such as Lyman Turnbull and Benjamin Wade, who believed that Lincoln had mishandled the war, particularly with regards to his selection of the generals in charge. Lincoln reassigned Burnside to the Western Theater and replaced him with General Joseph Hooker, who had served in several battles of the Eastern Theater. With the war dragging on, Lincoln signed the Enrollment Act, which provided for the first military draft in U.S. history. The draft law sparked harsh reactions, including draft riots in New York City and in other major cities. In April 1863, Hooker began his offensive towards Richmond, and his army encountered Lee's at the Battle of Chancellorsville. Despite possessing a larger army, the Union suffered another major loss at Chancellorsville, though the Confederates also suffered a high number of casualties, including their famous and well-regarded General Stonewall Jackson. After that Confederate victory, General Lee decided to take the offensive, launching the Gettysburg Campaign in June 1863. Lee hoped that Confederate victories in the offensive would empower Lincoln's political opponents and convince the North that the Union could not win the war. After Hooker had failed to stop Lee in the early stages of his advance, Lincoln replaced Hooker with General George Meade. Lee had led his army into Pennsylvania and was followed up by Lee's Army of the Potomac. While many in the North fretted over Lee's advance, Lincoln saw the offensive as an opportunity to destroy the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee and Meade's armies met at the Battle of Gettysburg in July 1st. The battle, fought over 3 days, resulted in the highest number of casualties in the war. Along with the Federal victory at the Siege of Vicksburg, the Battle of Gettysburg is often referred to as the turning point in the war. The battle ended with a Confederate retreat south out of Pennsylvania, but Lincoln was dismayed that Meade had failed to destroy Lee's army. Feeling that Meade was a competent commander despite his failure to pursue Lee in this situation, Lincoln allowed Meade to remain in command of the Army of the Potomac. The Eastern Theater would be locked in a stalemate for the remainder of that year. Here we come to another profound historic moment. In November 1863, Lincoln was invited to Gettysburg to dedicate the first national cemetery and honor the soldiers who had fallen there. His Gettysburg Address became a core statement of American political values. The address became the most quoted speech in American history. In 272 words and 3 minutes, Lincoln asserted the nation was born not in 1789, following the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, but with the 1776 Declaration of Independence. He defined the war as an effort dedicated to the principles of liberty and equality for all. The emancipation of slaves was now part of the national war effort. He declared that the deaths of so many brave soldiers would not be in vain, that slavery would end as a result of the losses, and the future of democracy in the world would be assured, that, quote, government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth, unquote. In this way, Lincoln concluded that the Civil War had a profound objective. It was a new birth of freedom in the nation. Compared to the eastern theater of the war, Lincoln exercised less direct control over operations that took place west of the Appalachian Mountains. At the end of 1861, Lincoln ordered Don Carlos Buell, commander of the Department of the Ohio, and Henry Halleck, Fremont's replacement as commander of the Department of the Missouri, to coordinate support with Unionists in Kentucky and eastern Tennessee. General Ulysses S. Grant quickly earned Lincoln's attention, winning the first significant Union victory at the Battle of Fort Henry and earning a national reputation with his victory at the Battle of Fort Donelson. The Confederates were driven from Missouri early in the war as a result of the March 1862 Battle of Pea Ridge. In April 1862, U.S. Navy forces under the command of David Farragut captured the important port city of New Orleans. Grant won further victories at the Battle of Shiloh and the Siege of Vicksburg, which cemented Union control of the Mississippi River and is considered one of the turning points in the war. We just mentioned that along with Gettysburg. In October 1863, Lincoln appointed Grant as the commander of the newly created Division of the Mississippi, giving him command of the Western Theater. Grant and Generals Hooker, George H. Thomas, and William Tecumseh Sherman led the Union to another major victory at the Battle of Chattanooga in November, driving Confederate forces out of Tennessee. The capture of Chattanooga left Georgia vulnerable to attack, raising the possibility of the Union march to the Atlantic Ocean, which would divide the Confederacy. Grant was one of the few senior generals that Lincoln did not know personally, and the president was not able to visit the Western theater of the war. Nonetheless, Lincoln came to appreciate the battlefield exploits of Grant. Responding to criticism of Grant after Shiloh, Lincoln had said, quote, "I can't spare this man. He fights," unquote. In March 1864, Grant was summoned to Washington to succeed Halleck as general-in-chief, while Halleck took on the role of chief of staff. Meade remained in formal command of the Army of the Potomac, but Grant would travel with the Army of the Potomac and direct its actions. Lincoln also obtained Congress's consent to reinstate for Grant the rank of lieutenant general, which no U.S. officer had held since George Washington. Grant ordered Meade to destroy Lee's army, while he ordered General Sherman, now in command of the Union forces in the Western Theater, to capture Atlanta. Lincoln strongly approved of Grant's new strategy, which focused on the destruction of Confederate armies rather than the capture of Confederate cities. Just 2 months after being promoted to General-in-Chief, Grant embarked upon his bloody Overland Campaign. This campaign is often characterized as a war of attrition, given high Union losses at battles such as the Battle of the Wilderness and Cold Harbor. Even though they had the advantage of fighting on the defensive, the Confederate forces had a similarly high level of casualties. The high casualty figures alarmed many in the North, but despite the heavy losses, Lincoln continued to support Grant. During the Valley campaigns of 1864, Confederate General Jubal Early crossed the Potomac River and advanced into Maryland. On July 11th, 2 days after defeating Union forces under General Ewell Wallace at the Battle of Monocacy, Early attacked Fort Stevens, an outpost on the defensive perimeter of Washington. Lincoln watched the combat from an exposed position. At one point during the skirmish, Captain Oliver Wendell Holmes shouted at him, "Get down, you damn fool, before you get shot." Afterward, Grant created the Army of the Shenandoah and put Sheridan in command. Sheridan quickly repelled Early and suppressed the Confederate guerrillas in the Shenandoah Valley. While the war was ongoing and seemingly was not to end anytime soon, Lincoln had to focus on the election of 1864. With Democratic gains in the 1862 and 1863 midterm elections, Lincoln felt increasing pressure to finish the war before the end of his term in early 1865. Hoping to rally Unionists of both parties, Lincoln urged Republican leaders to adopt a new label for the 1864 election. They called themselves the National Union Party. By the end of 1863, Lincoln had won the respect of many, but his renomination was not assured, as no president had won a second term since Andrew Jackson in 1832. In May of that year, 1864, a group led by Wendell Phillips nominated John C. Fremont for president. Most abolitionist leaders and radical Republicans, including William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and Charles Sumner, decided to support Lincoln over Fremont, as they believed that Fremont's candidacy would ultimately help the Democrats more than the abolitionist cause. Fremont even did himself in and endorsed this view, and he withdrew from the race in favor of Lincoln in September of 1864. The June 1864 National Union Convention nominated Lincoln for president. Though Vice President Hamlin hoped to be renominated, the convention instead nominated Andrew Johnson, a military governor of Tennessee. Lincoln had refused to weigh in on his preferred running mate, and the convention chose to nominate Johnson, a Southern war Democrat, in order to boost the party's appeal to Unionists of both parties. The party platform called for the unconditional surrender of the Confederacy and also endorsed open immigration policies, the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, and the establishment of the national currency. By August 1864, Republicans across the country were experiencing feelings of extreme anxiety, fearing that Lincoln would be defeated in the upcoming election. The outlook was so grim that Thurlow Weed told the president directly that his re-election was an impossibility. Lincoln, acknowledging this, wrote and signed a pledge that if he should lose the election, he would nonetheless defeat the Confederacy by an all-out military effort before turning over the White House. Quote, "This morning, as for some days past, it seems exceedingly probable that this administration will not be re-elected. Then it will be my duty to so cooperate with the President-elect as to save the Union between the election and the inauguration, as he will have secured his election on such ground that he cannot possibly save it afterwards." Unquote. In a fortunate turn of events, Lincoln's re-election prospects grew brighter after the Union Navy seized Mobile Bay in late August of that year, and General Sherman captured Atlanta a few weeks later. These victories relieved Republicans' defeatist anxieties, energized the Union-Republican alliance, and helped to restore popular support for the administration's war strategy. The 1864 Democratic National Convention met at the end of August, nominating George McClellan. Yes, that General George McClellan who had been fired by Lincoln on several occasions. The divided Democrats adopted a platform calling for peace with the Confederacy, but McClellan himself actually favored continuing the war. Of course he did. McClellan agonized over accepting that nomination, but after the Union victory in Atlanta, he accepted the nomination with a public letter. Confederate leaders hoped that a McClellan presidency would lead to the beginning of peace negotiations, potentially leaving an independent Confederacy in place. The Republicans mobilized support against the Democratic platform, calling it the Great Surrender to the rebels. The final election results gave Lincoln a major victory, as he took 55% of the popular vote and 212 of the 233 electoral votes. Lincoln's proportion of the popular vote was the largest share won by any presidential candidate since Andrew Jackson's 1832 re-election. Republican victories extended to other races as the party gained dominant majorities in both houses of Congress, and Republicans won nearly all of the gubernatorial races. Gubernatorial, that is actually the governors for the states. Getting back now to the military action in the middle of 1864, following the Overland Campaign, Grant's army reached the town of Petersburg, beginning the siege of Petersburg in June of that year. The Confederacy lacked reinforcements, so Lee's army shrank with every costly battle. Lincoln and the Republican Party had mobilized support for the draft throughout the North and were able to replace any Union losses. As Grant continued to wear down Lee's forces, efforts to discuss peace began. Now, after the results of the election of 1864, you had more and more of an effort by Southerners and Northerners to try to come to the end of this war. And on February 3rd, 1865, Lincoln and his Secretary of State Seward held a conference at Hampton Roads with three representatives of the Confederate government: Vice President Alexander H. Stephens, Senator Robert M.T. Hunter, and Assistant Secretary of War John A. Campbell, and they were there to discuss the terms to end the war. Lincoln refused to allow any negotiation with the Confederacy as a co-equal. His sole objective was an agreement to end the fighting, and unfortunately, those meetings produced no results. Grant ground down the Confederate Army across several months of trench warfare. Due to the city's important location, the fall of Petersburg would likely lead to the fall of Richmond. In the subsequent campaign, Lee escaped south and sought to link up with General Joseph E. Johnston, who was positioned in North Carolina, while Grant chased him and sought to force the surrender of his army. On April 5th, Lincoln visited the vanquished Confederate capital of Richmond. As he walked through the city, white Southerners were stone-faced, but freedmen greeted him as a hero, with one admirer remarking, quote, "I know I am free, for I have seen the face of Father Abraham, and have felt him," unquote. On April 9th, Lee would surrender to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, and the war was effectively over. Following Lee's surrender, other rebel armies soon did as well, and there was no subsequent guerrilla warfare as had been feared. Some of President Lincoln's non-war related leadership led to reforms enacted during his presidency. Many of the bills passed by the 37th and 38th Congresses were designed at least in part to pay for the war, but other bills instituted long-term reforms in areas unrelated to revenue. Congress passed the Homestead Act in May 1862, making millions of acres of government-held land in the West available for purchase at a very low cost. Under the act, settlers would be granted 160 acres of public land if they invested 5 years into developing the land. The Morrill Land Grant Colleges Act, also enacted in 1862, provided government grants for agricultural colleges in each state. The law gave each member of Congress 30,000 acres of public land to sell, with proceeds funding the establishment of land grant colleges. Another 1862 law created the Department of Agriculture to aid farming in the United States. The Pacific Railway Acts of 1862 and 1864 granted federal support for the construction of the United States' first transcontinental railroad, which was ultimately completed in 1869. In June 1864, Lincoln approved the Yosemite Grant enacted by Congress, which provided unprecedented federal protection for the area now known as Yosemite National Park. Unfortunately, Lincoln would never live to see Yosemite National Park. Shortly after 10 p.m. on Good Friday, April 14, 1865, President Lincoln was assassinated while attending a performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater with his wife and 2 guests. Lincoln was shot in the back of the head by actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth. The mortally wounded president was immediately examined by a doctor in the audience and then carried across the street to Peterson's boarding house, where he died at 7:22 a.m. the following morning. Lincoln's shadow looms large. His influence on the narrative and purpose of the United States government was profound and far-reaching. The successful reunification of the states had consequences for the name of the country. The term "the United States" has historically been used, sometimes in the plural, "these United States," and other times in the singular without any particular grammatical consistency. The Civil War was a significant force in the eventual dominance of the singular usage by the end of the 19th century. Legal historian Paul Finkelman argues that Union victory in the Civil War and the Reconstruction Amendments, which were ratified after Lincoln's death but were made possible by the Civil War, changed the nature of the Constitution. The Union victory and the subsequent Supreme Court case of Texas versus White ended debate regarding the constitutionality of secession and nullification by the states. In addition to ending slavery, the Reconstruction Amendments enshrined constitutional clauses promoting racial equality. Lincoln managed, in the process of saving the Union and killing slavery, to define the creation of a more perfect Union in terms of liberty and economic equality. Because he understood that victory in both great causes depended upon purposeful and visionary presidential leadership, as well as the exercise of politically acceptable means, he left as his legacy a United States that was both whole and free. As the most activist president in history, Lincoln transformed the president's role as commander-in-chief and as a chief executive into a powerful new position, making the president supreme over both Congress and the courts. His activism began almost immediately with Fort Sumter when he called out the state militias, expanded the Army and the Navy, blockaded the southern ports, suspended the writ of habeas corpus in several locations, and ordered the arrest and military detention of suspected traitors, and then, of course, his Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. To do all of these things, Lincoln broke an assortment of laws and ignored one constitutional provision after another. For instance, he made war without a declaration of war, and indeed even before summoning Congress into its special session. He countered Supreme Court opposition by affirming his own version of judicial review that placed the president as the final interpreter of the Constitution. For Lincoln, it made no sense to lose the nation yet preserve the Constitution. Following a strategy of unilateral action, Lincoln justified his powers as an emergency authority granted to him by the people. He had been elected, he told critics, to decide when an emergency existed and to take all measures required to deal with it. In doing so, Lincoln maintained that the president was one of three coordinate departments of government, not in any way subordinate to Congress or subordinate to the courts. Even more than that, he demonstrated that the president had a special duty that went beyond the duty of Congress and the courts, a duty that required constant executive action in times of crisis. While the other branches of government are required to support the Constitution, Lincoln's actions pointed to the notion that the president alone is sworn to preserve, protect, and defend it. In times of war especially, this power makes the president literally responsible for the well-being and the survival of the nation. The most lasting accomplishments attributed to Lincoln are the preservation of the Union, the vindication of democracy, and the death of slavery, all accomplished by the ways in which he handled the crisis that most certainly would have ended differently with a lesser man in office. His great achievement, historians tell us, was his ability to energize and mobilize the nation by appealing to its best ideals, while acting with malice towards none, in the pursuit of a more perfect, more just, and more enduring union. No president in American history ever faced a greater crisis, and no president ever accomplished as much. His presidency was one wrought with difficulty and danger, but it solidified the American ideas of freedom and equality, and some of the most positively influential actions ever made by a president in U.S. history were made by Lincoln. This thread of history takes us through the first political parties in the United States, the breakup of the Whig Party, debates about slavery in Illinois, convention ballots in Philadelphia, and the election and presidency of the first Republican president, the great emancipator, Abraham Lincoln. Thank you for listening to Episode 6 on Abraham Lincoln's presidency. This has been Threads of History. I am Mike Shellhammer. Thank you for listening. You can email your comments and suggestions to threads.historypodcast@gmail.com. Listen to more Threads of History on Anchor, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify.